Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to my regular update from Washington. And it's been one hell of a week. Let's start with the fact that we are approaching, as of tomorrow, a month in to the war with Iran. And let me be clear at the outset. This is a war of choice chosen by Donald Trump. There was no imminent threat. I have seen all of the intelligence. I'll be the first to acknowledge that the Iranian leadership has been awful for 47 years. But the reason why people haven't acted before is because everything that has happened was predicted by the intelligence. If we start a war with Iran, they will strike our Gulf neighbors. They will close the Strait of Hormuz, where 20% of the world's oil, 20% of the world's natural gas goes through. This was all predictable. And unfortunately, in this war so far, we are seeing the Iranians, who have not only still ballistic missile capabilities, but drone capabilities, literally bleed down American and Israeli interceptors. So we keep shooting off missiles that cost $2.4 million a piece to take down an Iranian drone that costs $50,000. That's a bad deal, particularly because we could have taken the Ukrainian technology that has figured out how to shoot down these drones. They offered it to this White House in December, and this White House blew them off. We're paying the price of that, and increasingly, protecting our troops, or Israel protecting its cities, or the Gulf neighbors protecting their cities, they're not going to be able to do this on a longer-term war of attrition. Even though our military has been brilliant, some of the balance shifts to Iran because they can just hang in. And then you would have thought, with these predictable things like closing of the Strait of Hormuz or bombing energy facilities in the Gulf, that we would have been prepared. But we are now, and let me be clear on this, not my words, but the International Energy Association said we're in the worst energy crisis of our lifetime. Worse than when many of these Arab states shut down oil to America in the early 70s. And we saw those long lines. We are about to see $4 gasoline. We've seen the cost of diesel fuel go up to over $6 a gallon. And 80% of all the trucks in America use diesel fuel, so that will drive up the cost of everything they deliver. We have seen jet fuel become almost unavailable at any cost. Airlines have already jacked up ticket prices, and one airline, United, has even stopped long-haul flights. Not all of them, but many of them. If you want to go to Asia, you want to go to Europe, you're not going to have the same number of options. We've seen fertilizer prices. I talked to a farmer in Amelia last week, go up 40% just as farmers across Virginia are getting into the growing season. And the fertilizer problem was made worse, not just because of the materials that come from the Gulf, but because our farmers were already reeling from fertilizer restrictions that come from our tariffs on Canada. We've also seen a lot of other, not directly oil-related shocks to the economy. Lots of the aluminum that comes from the world comes from smelters in the Middle East. They are closed down, and aluminum prices are at an all-time high. Helium, and I didn't understand this, helium, which is used in many of our chips that we use in all of our data centers and all of our military devices, use helium. After America, most of the helium provided by the world comes from the Middle East. That is basically slowed down to almost nothing. And, that will drive up costs. And then one that also should have been predictable is that while we only get a certain percentage, about 10% of oil from the Middle East, the Gulf, in America, in Asia, they get 80%. So a whole lot of countries in Asia are shutting down their economies on a forced one-day-a-week vacation because they don't have enough fuel for their workers to go to work. So anything we buy from Bangladesh or Vietnam or the Philippines going to go up in cost. All of the chips we still depend on Taiwan to supply us are going to go up in costs. And the remarkable thing is, if the president, this is his words, not mine, says, okay, I feel it in my bones, we've declared victory. You know, these facilities to get reopened and supply chains to come back, it will be months. So don't expect any Virginia driver to suddenly say gas prices are going to go back to where they were, $2.81 a gallon, when this is over. Don't expect that trucking costs that have got $6 plus a gallon diesel are going to go back to normal. And all of these other, the natural gas that comes from the region, literally they had to take it all out of these facilities because they were afraid if a bomb hit, you could have a fireball. None of this is going to happen quickly. And where are we a month in? Well, the president said he wanted regime change. We don't have that. Matter of fact, we've got worse Iranian leaders. Getting rid of their enriched uranium, well, that would require boots on the ground, minimum of 10,000 soldiers guarding the perimeter while people would go in to these bunkers and take this very volatile enriched uranium in canisters out. And let's be clear, what the Iranians would do then is they would shoot their own missiles toward these bunkers and can potentially, bury alive our troops. The question of getting rid of their missile capacity, no, we've taken out a lot of interceptors, but they've still got plenty left, and they got thousands of additional drones. And if we don't change how we shoot them down, we're going to run out of interceptors. And on the question of the Iranian Navy, we've sunk a lot of their ships, but they still have 500 plus these little speedboats where you can put a sea mine or a bomb on them, and they can easily continue to control the Strait of Hormuz. So what have we actually accomplished? We have knocked off some of their leadership. We have degraded some of their capacity. But there is a very real possibility, if we declare victory tomorrow, that the Iranians come out and say, hey, we just took on the United States and Israel and fought them to a tie. A wounded Iran in that region still poses a huge threat. These are all questions that should have been debated. And frankly, if the president wanted to choose this war, he needed to provide us, particularly those of us in the intel community who could have foreseen all of this, answers to, well, if this happens, what then? And sure as heck owed the whole American public that if we're choosing to go to war with Iran, here's our risks, here's what we could honestly expect to accomplish. None of that happened. So we are a month in with about 6,000 ground troops moving towards the region. We've got things like our sailors who were on the Ford and some of the escort ships that have been deployed from Norfolk now coming on about 9 months. We see the enormous challenge with a fire on the Ford or breakdown of some of the plumbing. Even with our best ships in the world, there's reasons the deployments are normally only 6 or 7 months. I feel for those sailors who don't know what's next, and our flyers and our Marines and Army that are headed to the region, when the goal now, or when the president's going to declare victory, is when, again, his words, he feels it in his bones. What kind of message does he as commander-in-chief give to our troops in harm's way? And I'm afraid, from the cost to the reflections on this war, let me add one last thing that's kind of the ultimate cherry on the cake. Because this administration has now chosen to relieve sanctions on Russian oil and Iranian oil, Russia, our adversary against our ally Ukraine, we put $10 billion into Putin's pocket to spend on his war machine going against our allies, the Ukrainians, who are using American equipment. And what's even worse, the partial release of sanctions on Iranian oil, for that oil that was already in transit, means $14 billion to the hardcore anti-American, anti-Israeli regime in Iran. Can you just fathom that for a minute? We are funding our enemy who's shooting at our troops, shooting at cities in Israel, shooting at our allies in the Gulf. And by giving them $14 billion of non-sanctioned Iranian oil, that's a lot of money for a country like Iran. So we're going to stay tuned on this, but it is incredibly disturbing that we didn't plan for these obvious outcomes, and unfortunately, I believe it put the world's best military, our American forces, in a level of harm's way that's unprecedented. Next subject. DHS and TSA, we got to get them funded. You know, we're still offering the idea of fund, if we can't decide on reforms for ICE and CBP, fund everything else, release the hostages, and keep fighting about, excuse me one second, keep fighting about ICE and CBP. One thing I can tell you, we sure as hell shouldn't leave town for any kind of break with airports overcrowded to, frankly, a national security risk. And the idea that the president has put ICE agents with no responsibility into our airports, and I hear from TSA agents, there's been public reporting as well, that our TSA agents who are already stressed are feeling on edge, their words, or spooked by having all these ICE guys wander around the airports, which also, I'm sure, freaks out a lot of the passengers. Let's get this resolved. Let's reach a compromise. Senate shouldn't leave town until it's done. On the question to a slightly better piece of news, I was really happy to see that power is now being generated from Virginia's offshore wind project. It's had to go through a heck of a lot of obstacles, literally the Trump administration trying with no reason to shut it down. Thank goodness the court said that would be a complete waste. So we're seeing some of the power start to flow. Ultimately, when this project is completed, it will literally power about 860,000 homes in Virginia. That doesn't meet all our needs, but to have that from a offshore source of wind that is climate good and carbon free. We need more electricity of all types of sources: natural gas, wind, solar, nuclear. And I'm glad to see that Dominion and the project supporters have hung in, and now we're starting to see some of the benefits. And those benefits will only grow as they build out the rest of the project. Finally, I want to talk about a bipartisan bill that I introduced with my friend Katie Britt, Republican from Alabama, and John Husted, the Republican senator from Ohio. It's called Sammy's Law. It's named after a young man named Sammy Chapman, and he unfortunately, through usage on social media, got sent drugs laced with fentanyl and died. This law would require the biggest platforms that have more than $1 billion in revenue and a certain number of users, to actually make sure they report if there is evidence that the user is using terms that may indicate he or she's going after drugs or going into anorexia or having other mental health issues, and would actually require these platforms to work with and have an interface with the Federal Trade Commission that actually has the ability to monitor. That so far they've not done, because there was a get-out-of-jail-free card called Section 230 that says these platforms owe no obligation to their users or any responsibility for the content. That might have been a good law in the 1990s. It is a huge burden on parents today. And I think the worm is turning. We saw just, I believe, this week, a court case that said that Meta, which is mostly think about as Facebook and YouTube, they're actually going to be held liable for some of the damage they're doing to parents, to kids and their parents. So parents have a really tough job navigating any guardrails on social media, and Congress totally was absent. I had lots of bipartisan legislation as long as 10 years ago on this. We could never get any traction. And let me just add one last comment before I go to the questions, which is, as challenging as social media platforms are, they are going to be tiny compared to the power of some of our artificial intelligence platforms. AI, I'm still optimistic about long term, but short term, we've got to put constraints on data centers so they don't pass on costs. We've got to make sure the AI community actually helps deal with the job dislocation that I think will be enormous over these next 2 to 3 years. I think we're going to see a record number of college graduates coming out, graduating in May of this year without jobs. And I can go into huge detail on that. But I do think Sammy's Law is a good step on social media. I think the court cases are a good step. But I do think, boy, oh boy, because a lot of the social media companies are now the AI companies. They are so huge. They owe an obligation to bring about this technology with some guardrails, to pay their fair share, and honestly help us figure out through this short-term job dislocation. And I am going to do everything I can to make sure they step up and pay their fair share. And I would add quickly, this is a debate that's going on in our legislature right now. And if they are able to secure a revenue stream, since we are the data center capital of the world, what happens in Virginia will be followed by other states. So again, my appeal to the AI tech guys is sit down at the table with us, pay your fair share, help us figure out this transition, make sure data centers are not robbing people unfairly of their power or water. We got to get it done. Why don't I stop there? I know I've gone on too long. Turn it over to Catherine for questions.
Good afternoon, Senator. Thanks for joining us. And I'd like to go back to the DHS shutdown. I know you'd like to see an immediate agreement on ICE reforms, but if that can't be reached in the coming 24 hours or so, is a separation of ICE funding the off-ramp for getting some type of agreement with everything else being approved? What would you like to see done?
Yeah, what we had said is we would do that, but not only for, we would not fund ICE and we would not fund Customs and Border Patrol, because huge numbers of the Customs and Border Patrol agents are not doing their statutory requirement. They are helping do ICE interior enforcement. So I think the ICE piece, I would definitely vote for something and say we'll keep arguing about ICE. The CPB issue is a little harder because I do know we need to get our CBP folks funded as well, but it would be a little disingenuous if we said we don't funding ICE, but CPB is still going to have 60, 70, 80% of their personnel doing interior ICE enforcement. I have not been as deeply engaged as I might otherwise been, but I have put together a group of Democrats and Republicans that we're going to sit down and see if we could hammer something out. Unfortunately, the Senate Majority Leader, Senator Thune, who is a very decent guy, basically asked us to stand down. But this can't go on. This cannot go on. I mean, the only thing that would be more terrifying than the long lines is to see if God forbid, there was some kind of incident at an airport where you've got lines of people outside of the security perimeter. We are into something that is not only a huge inconvenience, not only a hit on the economy in terms of air travel that's already more expensive because of the Iran war, but also we're getting into the period where there could be security risks. And I almost feel like, the idea that the president decided to deploy ICE to our airports, it's almost like a thumb in the eye of those of us who want to see meaningful reforms, since they are don't take my word, literally take the words of TSA agents, that it's kind of scaring them and putting them on edge. president's got to meet us halfway, or even 40% of the way. We got to get this done.
Okay, our next question is from Nick Gilmore with Radio IQ.
Hi, Senator Warner. Thank you so much for taking the time. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the State Struggling Hospitals Act, just why that's so important, especially for hospitals in Virginia.
Yeah, we have had an unfair funding formula for rural hospitals for decades. And I've been trying to raise the reimbursement rate so that they're not put out of business. Because if a doc has a chance to go to Southwest Virginia, but he gets paid, twice as much to go to Richmond, not many folks are going to go to rural Virginia. Now you've got on top of that these Medicaid cuts from the big ugly bill, and we're going to see rural hospitals close. We've already seen Augusta Health close 3 rural health clinics. On the closure list, there's about 10 more Virginia hospitals that'll close. We've already seen many of the hospitals in Southside Virginia say, hey, we just can't afford to deliver babies anymore. So you're going to have to travel a couple of hours in some cases to be able to deliver your baby. That's not right. It's not fair. And this effort on the Save Hospitals Act focuses particularly on rural hospitals, but says we got to give them some help to get through this crisis. And the crisis is totally exacerbated by, again, my Republican friends who let the tax credits on the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, expire. And those have already hit close to 50,000 Virginians. What's going to be worse is going to be the 300,000 plus Virginians who will lose their health care coverage when the Medicaid cuts come in. That's bad policy. It's almost cruel. And folks, particularly in rural communities, even if they're not on Medicaid or don't use the ACA tax credits, are going to feel it in their lack of services delivered.
Our next question is from Michaela with WDBJ7.
Yes. Hi, Senator Warner. What are your thoughts on the growing spur of data centers in Virginia, and do you have concerns on the long-term impact?
Listen, I think data centers need to pay their way. Shouldn't be helping raise electric rates. They need to have their own energy generation source that's not passed on to consumers. I think that they need to make sure that they're not overusing water. I need to make sure that their backup generators are not adding to pollution in the region. And I think they need to actually, as an AI industry, contribute more to the great worker dislocation that's coming. Yesterday I used, I think, inappropriate words when I called out a proposal by Congressman AOC and Senator Bernie Sanders about putting a 1-year moratorium on data centers. I didn't agree with the idea, but I think I probably overspoke. But I understand the rationale behind AOC and Sanders' proposition. I'm just not sure a 1-year moratorium, which would only affect data centers that are 3 or 4 years out. There's already enough permitted and in the queue that's going to dramatically increase the supply. And we already see with the existing data centers, a entity like Anthropic's Claude program that has hit the software industry, hit the HR industry. I literally had one of the top venture capitalists in the country saying he's preparing to write down to zero the value on all his software investments, because the idea of hundreds or thousands of people working on software when 1 or 2 with an AI tool could be better, that is going to rock the job market. And so I think not only do we need to make sure the data centers pay their own freight and are properly screened and don't overuse water and need to be, let's face it, if we close them down in Virginia, they'll simply go to another state, and there are still counties that would get a lot of revenue. But I think the AI industry writ large needs to chip in more on what I think will be the, and I feel so much stronger on this than I did even in December, what will be the most dramatic job dislocation for entry-level jobs, particularly of people coming out of college, that we've ever seen. And AI already and data centers already are terribly unpopular. AI's recent poll was viewed as less popular than ICE, the enforcement agency. And I don't want us to, I don't want us to lose the AI struggle with China. And two, there's going to be a lot of innovation. There could be just incredible things, particularly around medicine, that could come out of AI and increase productivity. But this short-term transition is going to be tough, and we really need the industry to step up. And I think so I'm open to all ideas. I respectfully disagree with the one-year moratorium, but I did use over-the-top language. I get why they suggested it. I'm more interested in how we can make sure that this new emerging industry, where there is more capital than anything I've ever seen come to building these data centers and these models, that they got to pay their fair share. I think I may wore everybody out with my 15-minute entrance, and that didn't even touch the 4 or 5 other issues, including crypto, that we're working on this week. So thanks, everybody, and be safe.